Gary Coben, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What are we facing in 2023? Depending on which side of the political aisle you sit on, we're either heading towards or possibly maybe in a global recession. That means, Mr. Customer, are you prepared to do more with less? Okay, so simply stated, we deliver integrated remote workforce technologies that enable IT departments to do more with less by getting them out of the PC and the PBX business. And we do that by leveraging VMware, Microsoft, Cisco, and Citrix. Evolve IP is a Microsoft Gold partner and global CSP, and that means that we sell and compensate our partners on the sale of Office 365 and Azure. And for the clients, they get one throat to choke. One of the big things for Evolve IP is the fact that we were still one of the first direct routing providers for Microsoft Teams Voice. The same thing we do with Microsoft Teams, we do with Cisco WebEx. Evolve IP has its own omni-channel contact center platform that is fully integrated with Microsoft Teams and Cisco WebEx. You can also leverage our DaaS client for those clients that are going remote and they want to use us or any contact center or UCaaS solution. So let's take a look back for a second. These were the hot topics that was on everybody's mind last year. Security emerged and continues to be a big focus for a lot of companies. DaaS is secured in the cloud, not on the device. So a lot of the things that you hear about endpoint protection and different services that are designed, they're all designed for that traditional corporate-owned PC network. Last year, people were talking about consolidating. This actually might represent the biggest opportunity for all of us in 2023. What does that mean? That means that the whole world has migrated to Teams or Zoom or WebEx, but most companies are still managing a corporate PC network. Last year, in the lead up to the recession, people were talking about controlling costs, getting more value from their budget. I got news for you. 2023 will likely mean that we're not looking about controlling costs. We're looking actually to reduce costs. I know at my age, I've been through a number of economic downturns and have always seemed to do extremely well when people were looking to not just control costs, but reduce costs. Last year, everybody was talking about mobility. Again, that whole post-pandemic thing. We like our work experience to be the same, whether people are working in the office or from home. And that's going to be even harder to accomplish if IT is faced with a lower budget going into 2023. What's on everybody's mind? Layoffs. I think earlier this week, I heard about Amazon laying off 18,000 people, Salesforce, Rift 10%. We've heard about layoffs at Ring and 8 and Microsoft and Cisco. But what's most interesting to me, 18 months ago, we were talking about the Great Resignation. And we've shifted from the Great Resignation to seeing increased layoffs impacting all industries and all sectors. It means you got to do more with less. And the question, if I was a CIO or CTO, that I'd be asking myself is, do I have enough resources to continue to procure, provision, secure, manage and maintain / support, refresh, and ultimately reclaim corporate-owned assets like PCs and servers? If you've been keeping tabs with the trade rags, you'll know that it's been predicted that chip shortages will now continue through the end of 2023. And if you're a CIO or CTO, you are going to be faced with extending the life of existing IT assets. Here we are, mid-January. There's no end in sight for the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a potential threat that mainland China could invade Taiwan, the world's largest producer of microprocessors, right? So this whole concept of geopolitical unrest only sort of adds fuel to the fire. So again, if you're a CIO, similar to the first question, is my IT department prepared to refurbish and support our already outdated devices? Now, rather than this concept of mobility and security being like the main thing as it was last year, I view mobility and security as just layering on to the problems, because now I've got a bunch of refurbished PCs out there And I've got my remote users connecting refurbished devices from, of course, an unsecured broadband connection. The one theme we bring forward from last year is corporate PCs with VPNs ain't going to get the job done. So if I'm a CIO, the question is, how do I provide secure access to any device without the need for a VPN or a corporate owned PC? When there is a recession, especially a global recession, that means that we are likely going to see budget cuts, layoffs, resource limitations. The key word about recession is global. That means we're talking about impacting all companies, all industries, all departments, and all geographies. The opportunity is that 2023 is likely going to be the year of DaaS. We found out just this week that Gartner was moving away from a DaaS market guide and actually going to do a full DaaS Magic Quadrant, which is very meaningful. So why are we thinking that 2023 is the year of the DaaS? Is because virtual desktop requires less IT support, not subject to chip shortages because it's not reliant on PCs, is inherently a solution that's more secure, allows IT to do more with less. DaaS really moves the needle. And I can tell you right now, selling $7 UCaaS seats and $50 cable modems, it's going to be hard to make a living in 2023. But what's interesting about this slide, this is our top 50 channel customers that we originally brought in for $866,000. Because of DaaS, those customers are now billing $2.2 million. That represents a 160% increase in revenue. But what's most revealing about this is the color. On that second column, that big gray box, that's virtual desktop. And that enables you to start with an account that's got an MRR of $17,000. And today, those same customers are billing $44,000 a month. What's so interesting about Evolve IP and our ability to start with Teams and migrate from Teams to desktop to infrastructure to the security elements that we bring is we've got lots of examples of customers that started at $19,000 are now billing $200,000. Started at $25,000 are now billing $180,000. The one thing that's unique about all of these customers is they're using desktop as a service. So I believe that is it for me.
Yeah, appreciate it, Gary. So, hey, everybody. For anyone who doesn't know me, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet. My name is Kevin Sullivan. I'm the Director of Solutions Engineering here at Evolve IP, specifically focused on our compute practice. So really, largely our desktop as a service offering, but all the other pieces and components that go along with that, as far as like hosted infrastructure, business continuity, disaster recovery, backup, Microsoft 365 licensing, you name it. Everything that really goes into a fully fledged compute solution, really the precipice of which, from our perspective, recession of IT being asked to do more with less, right? But the challenge now is we're going to be asked to do more with more less, right? There's going to be even less coming in from a budgetary perspective, and really forcing folks to layer and leverage the tools that they already have in a very productive fashion. So DaaS for an organization can be a fundamental game changer in that process, right? You tend to not think, hey, when budgets are tight and I don't really have the money to go out and spend, going out and spending money can counterintuitively be such a good thing for an IT department. But I think we can make a really good case here in kind of 4 key areas of how DaaS can still help organizations specifically with that. If you're anything like me, I'm a big fan of mnemonic devices, right? Anything that can make things a little bit easier to remember, a little bit easier to re-articulate when we're describing it to someone else. And specifically with desktop as a service, the mnemonic device that I've really kind of come to grow and love here is this concept of keeping DaaS simple, right? There's been a lot of history with desktop as a service in the channel specifically, but just in the market in general of it being a very complicated solution. And from a technical perspective, it can be, right? Once we get into the nuts and bolts of it, there are a lot of things we have to worry about in terms of latency, in terms of where things are hosted, how users are connecting into the solution, the applications that they're running when they're within there. But if we really take a look at it from a value add perspective, the 4 key pieces of value that DaaS can bring to any and every organization come down to security, mobility, performance or productivity, we can use those interchangeably, and logistics. So if we highlight on these 4 key things, I think we can, again, help to make a really compelling use case for DaaS for organizations that are really struggling. No one wakes up in the morning and says, gee, I can't wait to go out and buy a desktop solution today. Our life would be a lot easier if it did, but that's not the way it tends to go. And with our DaaS solution, the way that we've structured it, the things that we can accomplish with it, we know we have the world's greatest hammer. The challenge is, how do we get the folks out in the market to understand that the problems that their businesses face on a daily basis are nails? This allows us to really get into the messaging to help with that, and really change the conversation away from what the nuances and the intricacies of the solution are to showing the value of how we help to solve the particular business problems that plague an organization. So let's jump right in. From a security perspective, one of the biggest things that DaaS allows an organization to do is to get into a position where their data never has to leave the data center, right? So those 4 logical walls that we build from a security perspective, from a compliance perspective, that area that we now can say is secure is where that data lives and continues to be worked on and where it resides, whether it's in use or in rest. So long, complicated way of saying, that data never leaves the data center, right? So if a user has a laptop, that old school method of, if that user is remote or mobile today, they connect into an organization, grab the data that they want to work on, bring that data local to their machine, do whatever they're going to do to it, and then put it back when they're done. Well, that introduces a lot of risk to an organization, right? If that device is lost, is stolen, is compromised in some fashion, there now is company data that exists on that end user device that we have to be, conscientious of, especially with the concept of a hybrid workforce, right? When COVID happened and everyone was forced to kind of make do, at least initially, with what they had as far as enabling their users to work remotely. If folks connected from a home machine or, the machine on which their kids play games, or, who knows what else they might be doing on it, that opens us up to a lot of potential risk of housing company data or making those devices an extension of our company network. So with a well-structured DaaS solution, we can now get away from that mentality. The other side of this too, not just in terms of, how our users connect and how they store and house data, is it's human nature that when something is challenging and is difficult to do, we tend to not do it as well or as often. So what that means from an IT perspective is, when we have all these devices that are scattered all over the country or all over the world in some cases, doing basic security, practices like applying Windows updates, applying updated antivirus definitions, updating and patching our applications, those things become a challenge. When they're challenging, our IT teams are less likely to do them or do them as effectively as they can if we could make that job more simple. So what that means is, inherently, having more control of your environment naturally leads to better security of that environment. If we can make it easy to apply patches that, I don't have to worry about if Gary has a laptop and is in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania today and is, out at a prospect meeting or out at a customer site in Nebraska tomorrow and then in California on the weekend. None of that matters, because wherever Gary is and whatever he's using to connect, the desktop on which he's actually doing his work now is within our solution, is within the 4 walls that we control, and we can much more easily patch that desktop, patch the applications that are on it, provide better antivirus control. And then the last piece here from a security perspective is, we'll hear a lot of, trends and buzzwords out in the market for things like zero trust, SASE, right? So not to say that these being trends is a bad thing, right? The more organizations do to embrace better security posturing and better compliance, the better for all of us, because our own data is secure when it's out there in the world. But these things are also complicated by nature, and DaaS may not itself be the solution to put zero trust in place for an organization or help them move to a SASE architectural model. But what DaaS can do is provide a much more easy way to implement these types of solutions and these types of, particular security or compliance frameworks or regulations for organizations going forward. So even in situations where DaaS itself is not necessarily the entirety of the security solution that a customer is looking for, it's still an enablement piece to help that customer get to the level of security they need in a much more straightforward and simple fashion.
It's interesting. Every event that I went to in the last 6 months of 2022, there was 2 or 3 of these cybersecurity companies, and I think you and I have talked privately about selling fear, and there's only 2 kinds of companies. those that have been breached and those that haven't been breached yet. I appreciate the fact that when you were talking about desktop as the cornerstone of a security solution, what thoughts do you have relative to endpoint protection and SASE, and that you're not suggesting you don't need to deploy that stuff. You're just suggesting it's a whole lot easier to deploy it after you've migrated to DaaS than trying to do it through a VPN connection.
Yeah, it's a great question, Gary. And the honest answer is it depends. Historically, the way of thinking was if my users are using this laptop, this desktop, whatever's sitting here at my home office to connect in and do their work, we have to worry about managing and securing that device. But if you work in a well-structured DaaS solution, really all that client device should now be doing is input-output data, so your keyboard and mouse, right? And the screen refresh for the data that's coming back to you for the machine that you're working on. So if we think about that, then the big piece around security now becomes how do we protect specifically against screen capture, right? So malware or spyware that can sit there and see the things that are happening on your screen, or keystroke loggers, right? Things that can sit there and run on your machine to gather all the different, data that you're entering via your keyboard. One of the really interesting things with DaaS and the way that DaaS has grown specifically in the last 2 to 3 years is now DaaS actually has secure clients that are able to add an obfuscation layer. So they're able to add some encryption and some device protection that can specifically guard against screen capture and keystroke logging. So even if you were to run a keystroke logger, all you're going to see on the client machine is gibberish because the actual keystrokes between the keyboard and the DaaS client itself are encrypted. So what that means, right? The short way of saying it is we can now get to a point where we can even not have to worry so much about those things on that client device itself. The other big consideration here is we're seeing a large fluctuation in state law that kind of hit the pause button a little bit because of COVID, but is going to likely start to resume again around the balance between user privacy and corporate security. So especially for organizations that go into a bring your own device or a BYOD model, if a company requires that they have some form of management software on your device for you to access it to use it for company purposes, if that user has an issue, now from a liability perspective, who's responsible, right? If you find that their privacy was violated, is it because of the management software that your organization put on that device, or is it because of the manner in which that user used that device? So there's this growing gray area that's continuing to get a little bit bigger and bigger, and we started to see it kind of blossom in California. But starting to become a bigger part of the conversation elsewhere around where that line is and who takes the liability of a device once an organization, whether that's a company, a school, whatever, requires that they have some form of management software on that device that could itself become a gateway to compromisation. If we think about DaaS, right, we kind of segue from security into mobility. As Gary mentioned, the hybrid workforce is here to stay. I don't think that's surprising to any of us at this point in time. The piece that may be surprising, though, is that even for organizations that are dead set on bringing all of their folks back into the office and saying we've decided it's not in our best interest to pursue remote work, they still need a solution for how to deal with this if we find ourselves in the unfortunate situation again where, hey, March rolls around and everyone's told once more, we're going to have a lockdown and send your people home. I certainly don't want it to happen. I'm sure none of you want it to happen, but we have to plan for that now as part of our organizational continuity, business continuity, and disaster recovery strategies for if that were to occur again, what do we do to mitigate the problems that we had previously? So even for organizations that aren't intending to do hybrid work as their model, they still need to have a hybrid work solution should that be thrust upon them in the near future. What DaaS allows us to do is to have organizations really enable a strategy that allows their folks to work from anywhere. That's probably not surprising, right? These solutions have been remote access solutions at their core for a very long time, and they were designed with latency in mind, right? We always have to be conscientious of, hey, if we're going to host a desktop in the cloud, where's that desktop in relation to the user that's connecting to it, right? What does that connectivity look like? What's needed there? But also, what's the connectivity look like between that desktop and where the stuff that they're working on is, right? Are those hosted in the same location directly adjacent to one another? Is the user in a branch location connecting to a desktop that's then potentially looking to connect back to data that's hosted in that branch location? So we need to be conscientious of those things in terms of design, but these solutions are specifically designed around remote access to be friendly to, situations where latency could be higher, or latency or bandwidth could be variable. So connectivity is always required to get to a hosted DaaS seat, but it doesn't have to be supremely robust connectivity, right? Just the standard home internet user is going to be beyond fine in far more cases than not. The other big piece here that's a huge unlock for a number of organizations that tells a great mobility story is the ability to now take your unified communications and contact center solutions with you and your collaboration as well. So kind of roll collab and UC into one big bucket there. So what that means is, historically, if any of you have experience with VDI or DaaS, I'm sure you probably won't be surprised to hear this. The challenge historically was always that VDI was great for productivity users. It's not good for users that are doing anything media rich in their desktop solution, right? It's not good for video. It's not good for audio. It's not good for, AutoCAD and 3D modeling applications and photo editing. But what has changed in the last 2.5 years is now the DaaS solutions themselves are smart enough to say, hey, Gary, I see you're connected to a virtual desktop and I see you're running a Teams call. I know that that virtual desktop is not good at running that Teams call because the processor's not good at doing the audio and video. But you know what is? The processor that's in this device that you're connecting from that's otherwise sitting here and doing nothing. So what the DaaS solutions are now capable of doing through their client with what they call RTAV optimization. I'll explain why the air quotes in a second. But what the DaaS solutions are now doing is leveraging those local resources to help with the pieces that DaaS has historically not been good at. The cool thing here is that they're also doing it in a secure fashion because everything is still staying within that DaaS session. The only difference is now that DaaS session is just leaning on your local CPU and RAM a little bit more than it would have in the past. So what that allows you to do is take your Teams and your Zoom calls with you wherever you are. Take your soft phone with you. Take your call center application with you. So all of those things now happen in that hosted desktop that is accessible from virtually any device from anywhere that they have connectivity. And that, again, is really game-changing for the way that DaaS can be a fit for organizations. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but especially for things like business process outsourcers and call centers, right? Where you have a large distributed workforce that have to run a soft phone client that maybe in the past you had to specifically provision new devices for and put that stuff out there in the market for them. Or you would find yourself in a situation where, hey, I'm a user, and if I'm doing, office applications or working in my EHR application, I go into my DaaS seat. But if I want to make a phone call, I have to minimize my DaaS seat and work on my local device. We can get away from all that complexity, all that split brain mentality that folks have had to have in the past.
So for those of you that don't know this, towards the end of last year, we did a deal with Five9, where our virtual desktop solution has been certified by Five9 as an alternative solution to running a PC. Every application, right? Whether you're putting Adobe Acrobat inside of a PC or a virtual desktop, or you're putting, a UCaaS or CCaaS client, has a requirement for so much CPU, so much RAM, and so much storage. And that's sort of the beauty of what we've now been able to accomplish with real-time audio video, is that not only can we meet those requirements, but the one other thing that Kevin mentioned that I want to sort of drive on is that as soon as we got into these calls with Five9, they're like, yeah, great, this is terrific. Just take the voice and run it local, right? Now, as soon as you take the voice and run it local, now you've just made your client fall out of compliance. And the unique thing about Evolve IP is our ability to run that audio and video inside the desktop, keeping the entire solution compliant.
And the piece for us that's really the differentiator, because look, the technology is the technology, right? So any provider out there who offers a DaaS solution can check the boxes to say, yes, we enable the optimization of real-time audio and video in our desktop solution if they run the same platforms that we do. The difference with us is Evolve IP is the only company out there that our background is specifically in unified communications and collaboration and compute. So for us, the culmination of these two technologies is like the perfect intersection of our areas of specialty and where we have deep technical benches with not only a ton of knowledge, but with a wealth of experience in working in unified communications and collaboration, agents, in contact center agents and solutions, and in virtual desktops and the compute backend that goes along with it.
And the only thing that I would add to that is what we've seen come from our TSB, TSD community is contact center, right? I mean, that's where they're pushing all the sales partners into well, not everybody can be a contact center player. The one thing that we love about desktop as a service is there's hardly anybody that does it anymore. What a unique opportunity for all of you and certainly for us to be actually out there talking about a technology where there's not 12,000 other people doing the same thing.
The way that telecom providers and soft phone providers used to talk about optimizing their voice solution for a DaaS user basically meant they were doing an end around. They were taking all of that voice traffic and going outside of the DaaS solution to process it on the client device. Even though we're talking about leveraging the client device to help with processing the voice traffic, the way it happens with optimized DaaS is everything stays within that DaaS session, and it's actually the DaaS client itself that engages with the local hardware on that device to optimize the voice solution in the DaaS seat. So it's really just a matter of, from a network perspective, where does the stuff flow to? Does it flow to that laptop that they're connecting from, or does it flow into their DaaS session? So the more stuff that we can keep all within that DaaS session, the better things are from a security and a compliance standpoint.
Traditional methodology of taking voice and pulling it out of the DaaS solution, right? Well, as soon as you do that, if we certify to the client that we are high trust or PCI compliant, well, once they take the voice and they take it outside of our solution, the client can no longer attest to, hey, we use Evolve IP and they're high trust and SOC and PCI certified. So that's what I mean about once you take the voice or the video and you pull it outside of the DaaS solution, you've put your whole compliance position out of sync.
Or at the very least in jeopardy, depending upon the level of detail that your auditors are going to get to.
Now companies are forced to have all this cyber insurance, and those companies are getting much more stringent on what's required.
So from a performance perspective, right, we talked about security, we talked about mobility. We'll briefly touch on performance because I feel like this is largely table stakes, but the overarching concept here is that if we take where our people are doing their work and where the stuff that they're working on is, and we put them next to each other, it's just like shortening your commute to the office, right? Like the less distance that data has to travel back and forth, there are natural productivity, performance, and enhancements that happen as a result of that. So that proximity just tends to make for an overall better user experience. We also allow ourselves to get to the situation where, like we talked about earlier, with that VPN in to pull data down to then put data back when you're done, that round trip going away and just connecting in and doing all my work on the data over here and then just logging out when I'm finished, that makes for a better user experience too. From a performance perspective, the piece that might be a little bit less obvious are the performance enhancements that happen to your IT team when you go to a solution like this as well. And largely that comes down to scalability, right? So not just the ability to scale and add desktops quickly, but to scale our resources in those desktops without having to go through a procurement cycle or a purchase process to get new devices in place, right? Now we can say, hey, Gary, you have a machine that has 2 CPU and 6 gigs of RAM and 100 gigs of disk. And all of a sudden, Gary's role changes tomorrow, or we introduce a new application into our sales strategy that has a higher degree of resource than that. Well, the time was we would have had to then go out and buy Gary a new laptop. Now it's just, hey, Gary, we've updated the specs on your DaaS seat. So when you log in tomorrow, you're going to have the resources that your new application stack requires, as opposed to, being stuck in a logistical loop that we'll talk about in a second here as well. And then the last piece is, like we talked about earlier, right? From a security perspective, more control means better security, but also having the universality of how our people connect and what they connect to makes IT's job much easier in general. So things like patch distribution and application installation, the ability to very quickly and easily onboard and offboard users. So we see this a lot, especially for organizations that have an M&A, growth strategy, right? If you're doing a lot of mergers and acquisitions, how can you have a scalable, predictable cost model to know if I require a new practice next week that's 1,000 people or 2 people, I know exactly what the cost impact is per user to bring them into our current systems. How can we find ourselves in a situation where we can help to skirt some of those logistical challenges? Well, the biggest one is eliminating what I like to think of as the 3 Ps, right? Procuring, provisioning, and providing equipment out there for our users. How can we break that cycle of, going out there and buying this new stuff on an ongoing basis? And the way that we get around that is to say, you have a laptop or a device that you use right now. If you're using that as just a conduit to get to the actual machine that you're doing your work on, doesn't matter if that device is 3 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old. If that device works and you can replace it whenever it actually just needs to be replaced, we don't have to age it out. There is no longer a cycle of it. The flip side of that coin is we always have this conversation specifically around provisioning, right? Going out and getting new things. It wasn't until very recently that we started to look at the reverse side of that with reclamation. Interesting story, right? We had a business process outsourcer, and for anybody who's not familiar with that term, that largely translates to a managed call center that services a number of other external companies. So we had one of those reach out to us early last year, and they actually worked with a number of energy firms out on the West Coast. The challenge that they brought to us, right? Because nobody wakes up and says, gee, I can't wait to go buy a desktop solution. The challenge they brought to us is we staff these call center agents. It's a rather low paying hourly job because they need to run a soft phone for the call center. We buy every single one of them a mid-range Chromebook. We ship it out to them. We start their onboarding process. Their attrition rate through their 4-week onboarding process was close to 80%, right? So 80% of the folks that started this process to onboard as a new call center agent weren't making it through the month-long training to actually begin their employment in the organization. Imagine the challenge of this organization going out and reclaiming all of those devices. What are you ultimately going to do at that point? Threaten to withhold a paycheck for an employee who may have been making $13, $14 an hour, depending on the location from where they were working? It got to the point that the CIO, and I believe the CFO is who we were speaking with, were concerned that there was a Reddit thread or a Twitter post somewhere that said, hey, if you want a new laptop, don't go out and buy it. Take a job with this company and then just quit after 2 weeks because they're never going to be able to come after you to get that device back. So reclamation is a huge part in the new workforce, right? With hybridization, with remote work, that we have to account for, not just putting devices out there, but getting them back and kind of getting out of this cycle of, especially in the healthcare space, I like to think of it as CPR, right? Configure, provisioning, and reclaiming these devices and just going through that loop on an ongoing basis. And every time we go through that loop, some of those devices fall by the wayside. So if we look at, asset loss and time loss, every single device that goes out is 3.5 to 4 hours roughly on average for IT to get a device ready. That's not including the purchase time and the lag time in shipping. So then we provision that device out there to our users. And from a reclamation perspective, the stats that we looked at were, I think, for year ending 2021, but SMEs saw usually higher than 10% asset loss when they were trying to reclaim devices from employees who were no longer with the organization. And the one that scares the heck out of you is healthcare organizations. Healthcare organizations were higher. You would never think that was going to be the case, right? They were higher than SMEs with 10 to 20% asset loss on average, reclaiming assets from employees who left their respective organizations.
So 3.5 to 4 hours to unbox a PC and get it ready for a user, right?
Yes, correct. Sorry, I thought that was a rhetorical question.
How long to provision a virtual desktop?
Seconds. I mean, it's literally a mouse click. And if you wanted to deploy 1 seat or 10,000 seats, it's that same mouse click. It's just changing the number to what you want and then hitting the provision button and those resources being available.
So again, the pearl here, guys, is we know there are economic challenges. We know that there's going to be a reduction in IT budgets. We know there are potentially going to be layoffs, right? Can you imagine what the idea of this means to a CIO that is looking to take his limited resources and get them doing things that are more important to the business than spending 4 hours provisioning a new PC?
Well, I might be able to even do you one better, Gary. I have some numbers here that I put together when I was putting this together that I actually forgot that I even had in the notes section of this slide. So if we assume that the average laptop cost is about $800 per device, right? And the average SMB is around 1,500 users, we'll just kind of go with that as a good number. 2022, the average rate of turnover in an organization was 18%. And the average loss rate for devices for that turnover was 10%. So if we take that 1,500 users and $800 per device per user, That would take us to 270 users per year, $21,600 in money that literally just evaporated from their IT budget for no reason. And yeah, sure, $21,600 might not sound like all that much if you're talking about the IT budget for an organization of 1,500 users. That could be a month's DaaS, right? Right there. That they're losing every year just in terms of devices that walk out the door that never come back. So, there is a real world impact to this and real world numbers that we can ascribe to it to help folks see, like, yes, there is a cost of doing business, but that cost of doing business shouldn't be $21,000 worth of computers that went out the doors of your office building and never came back to it. And that's just on average. There are going to be organizations that are outliers that are probably much higher than that, like that BPO that we talked about. So with that, I'll just kind of leave it here with, the DaaS sweet spots that we specifically target, right? If we're looking for helping to identify where these opportunities, where these specific business challenges around security, compliance, cybersecurity, scalability, M&A based growth, mobility in the hybridization of the workforce, logistical challenges around procurement, how to put BYOD in place, all of these myriad of different problems that folks have out there in the market that may not in their heads translate to a DaaS solution being the way to solve. These are the 5 key areas where we see the highest attenuation of those challenges in the market. DaaS is a great solution and a sticky solution, right? So there's a lot of merit to organizations staying with a DaaS provider once they finish their onboarding and start to run. But it's staggering how many folks come to us because they're stuck in that implementation process with another DaaS provider, right? And I won't speak disparagingly about any of our competitors. DaaS comes with its challenges from an implementation perspective, but if implemented right, and if the discovery is done right up front to make sure that we uncover all the areas where the solution can help a customer and how we get from point A to point B in doing that implementation for them. When a customer has DaaS and has a support structure around DaaS that works for them, they're very unlikely to leave. So again, just to say, there are a lot of folks that are out there working with other DaaS providers that have not quite gotten over that hump yet, that are an opportunity for us to talk to and look at providing services for. And then the last is folks that kind of fall in that middle ground of do-it-yourself VDI and competitive DaaS, which is folks that have started to go down the public cloud route on their own with either Azure Virtual Desktop or Amazon Workspaces.
Whether it's running on a PC or a refurbished PC, it's not doing anything but actually showing an image of what's being done in the cloud. So that could mean Chromebook, it could mean iPad, it could mean thin client, it could mean zero client. More importantly, it definitely means that old 2 gig PC that you got sitting on the shelf that you won't throw out because it still lights up. Anything you want to add to that, Kev?
Yeah, I was gonna say the best cost here is $0, right? So one of the things that DaaS opens up for us is the ability to continue to utilize hardware that's seen better days. As long as it's functional to be able to connect reliably to a network, to connect to the internet and run the DaaS solution. One of the things we have to be conscientious of when it comes to the RTAV optimization, so having that real-time audio and video, is the hardware of the underlying client, since that starts to factor into that audio and video streaming, starts to become part of the picture again. But suffice to say, the most important thing in that case then is just making sure it's a supported operating system that supports optimization. All that boils down to, if you hear Chromebooks right now, Chromebooks and real-time audio video optimization still don't necessarily go perfectly hand in hand. So there's a conversation to be had there when those situations come up.
Good call. FedRAMP.
Yeah, so from a compliance perspective, we have a number of different compliances that are available to us. So Evolve IP, by default, we have our high trust CSF certification. We can do PCI. PCI is always on an individual customer basis. I don't know why that was that hard to say. But that's just because the nature of PCI means there's a shared responsibility matrix that has to get worked through. So specifically around governmental compliances, things like FedRAMP, ITAR, those are not part of our default offering that is on the truck today, but we are willing to evaluate any opportunity and take it through our internal review process, because there are always options for us to pursue specific solutions that leverage things like the GovCloud architecture of Azure if the opportunity is a right fit. So usually that boils down to overall size, but also complexity around some of the other things that they may be looking to do from a third-party perspective to layer into that solution. So it doesn't preclude us from talking to them, but FedRAMP and ITAR are also, and DoD are really not a space that we play in on a regular basis.
Naturally, this sounds great. What are the primary objections you normally hear from a CIO?
So I'll leave it at two, right? One that's easily solvable and one that isn't. The easily solvable one is price. When it comes to desktop as a service, everyone's thought process, what we've been told as an industry for the last decade is DaaS is not a pure cost play. That is true. DaaS is not a pure cost play if we compare it just to the cost of going out and buying a device divided by 36, right? Where DaaS can end up being financially better and incentivized for a customer is once we account for all of the soft cost components that go into it, right? You can look at roughly a 30% on average reduction in administrative costs per desktop in your organization. You can look at an up to 60% reduction in help desk expenses per device within your network as industry standards. So there is a lot that goes into this that is not just take the cost of a laptop and divide it by 36 months and compare it to the cost of a DaaS seat. We allow organizations to really take those soft cost spend and reallocate it in their organization to make their internal IT much more of an asset than a cost center to their business. So the one that's not solvable that we do get, which is, the one we do get which is not solvable is that DaaS requires connectivity. So you do need an internet connection in order to connect to your desktop that is hosted in the cloud to work. That isn't going to change. So if it is an industry, I think a couple that we've seen recently are oil drilling and oil platforms where connectivity is spotty or sporadic or not guaranteed. Those folks are a better fit for a traditional desktop model where they're going to be doing their work on the laptop or on the desktop that they actually have in front of them. We're seeing less and less and less of that as connectivity becomes more ubiquitous, but it is something to just keep in the back of our heads. If you have someone who will specifically say like, nope, if they need an internet connection, I'm not interested, you're probably not going to convince them to go to a cloud-based solution for anything, let alone a desktop.
Isn't provisioning of a device more automated today? So is that why, it may take 3.5 to 4 hours for a device to cycle, but the IT staffer isn't necessarily spending 3.5 to 4 hours sitting over a device? Is that a correct statement?
They may or may not be. It depends on what that organization's imaging strategy is. I am frankly surprised in many cases to hear that a lot of device configuration for companies that are still in this traditional model are still done manually. The reason for that is many organizations that have, in my experience, that have not gone to a solution like this are still kind of in that every device is a one-off approach where they don't have any form of siloed user by role within the organization that if you do this job, you get these applications. If you do this job, you get these applications. Many times that moving to a solution like DaaS precipitates organizations to take that role-based approach in terms of their distribution. The only alternative is organizations that just give everyone everything. And that poses some challenges as well from a licensing and security perspective. But yes, to your point, Jeff, in an ideal world, provisioning should be automated. Those folks should be able to just simply plug that device in, set an image to run on it, and walk away from it. There still is time to literally unbox that device, get it connected to the network, potentially join it to the domain, sysprep it either before or after that image runs, get it repackaged into the hands of shipping and out to the user as well. So even if it's not 3.5 to 4 hours, you're still looking at some form of not insignificant time investment, even if they have that automation in place. And again, it's surprising to me how few organizations that I talk to that are in that old school mentality do not have that automation in place.
It's often not an issue of hardware cost as new, but a transition cost from embedded costs of hardware to the new world. Can you speak to that?
So not going out and actually purchasing new hardware, but the transition of taking the assets that organizations already have and repurposing them into the model of hybridization. That's the way that I think I interpret the question. And the answer here is, if that is the question, that should be a solution more so than a challenge. And the reason that it's a solution is if organizations can take the embedded technology they already have and adapt it to be out there in the world remotely to leverage a DaaS solution to connect in, that organization has now moved forward with a mobile and secure work strategy, leveraging DaaS that allowed them to have no additional cost for compute assets that have to now get deployed to be that conduit to get to your DaaS solution. So basically, in essence, saying, hey, if you can switch if you can flip a switch and turn all the devices you already have into basically BYOD devices where, hey, we wipe these, we give them out to our users, use them for as long as you want to use them. When you want to replace them. You've now opened yourself up to a DaaS solution where folks can have that client hardware and it didn't cost your organization anything.
I have a medical client on Evolve's platform for voice and contact center, and they have all the issues you mentioned when distributing notebooks to call center employees all over the country. If we were to recommend Evolve IP for DaaS, can they migrate to smart terminals, and will it work for our voice products?
Yes. So any voice solution, including Evolve IPs that's leveraging WebRTC or HTML5, can benefit from RTAV optimization. Smart terminals here is probably the piece that I'll kind of key in on. If we're talking about that being, BYOD devices or thin clients, as long as those thin clients support running at least Windows 10 IoT as their operating system, absolutely. If we start to get into the conversation around zero clients, that's where it starts to get a little bit muddy again, because the way that real-time audio and video optimization engages with those local resources. But 1000% it is a combination of technologies that we should talk about and explore further for how we can better help that customer.
Jeff asked, top 5 verticals we should be bringing Evolve IP into.
In my experience with the opportunities that I've worked, medical, financial services, business process outsourcers, then 2 of the newer ones that we've started to delve into with some of our public cloud offerings that are available to us are organizations that work in architecture or 3D modeling and manufacturing. And those 2 last ones were use cases that were problematic for us before, specifically because of GPU or 3D model or 3D rendering capabilities of DaaS. That was something that we could not do until about 2 years ago.
So I would say, Jeff, that I agree with everything Kevin said, and there's only one thing that I want to make sure that I add to that list, because we've seen so much private equity money. Companies that are PE-backed companies that are in acquisition mode love virtual desktop. It gives them fixed costs per employee, right? Where they can say, I'm going to acquire a customer with 100 users, and they're all going to be on Teams. They're all going to have an E3 license. They're all going to have an 8 gig desktop, and their loaded cost per employee is $166.11. Compare that to the cost of trying to migrate the architecture of the company they just acquired. It's like a joke. So private equity companies that have the main interest in moving through the acquisition process quickly love virtual desktop.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your time today.
Take care, guys.
All right. See ya.